All right. How's it going, folks? It's so great to have you here with us today, whether you're hanging out live or joining us on the recording. It's always a pleasure to chat with you. My name is Kevin. I'm part of the Deno team, and I'm joined today by Bert Belder, who is the CTO of Deno, and we're going to talk a little bit about Deno Subhosting. And Bert will break it down for you a little bit more here in a minute, but subhosting is a feature of the Deno Deploy cloud platform that lets you run untrusted JavaScript code from your customers in Deno's cloud environment using a sort of simplified API that we've put on top of our infrastructure. So you can build in things like customization for your SaaS platform, ways to handle events within your developer tools, lots of very cool use cases like that, which we will talk about. But before we do any of that, I did want to give you, Bert, a chance to introduce yourself really quickly, and also talk a little bit about your role at Deno, your role in the Node community over time. I know you've been in the server-side JavaScript game for quite a while, so I would love for you to introduce yourself quick.
Thank you, Kevin. Yes, so I'm Bert Belder. On the internet, I go by Biscuitorius, if you ever want to find me there. And generally, maybe not such an interesting person, but what is relevant, I guess, is I've been involved in server-side JavaScript for over a decade now. Started in 2010 or 11, if I remember correctly, contributing to Node.js, and quickly became one of the core team members. Maybe my biggest claim to fame there is porting Node.js to Windows and building libuv in the process. Did that for quite a number of years, and after some segues into doing another startup that built API servers and selling that to IBM in the limit, I rejoined forces with Ryan Dahl, who is the actual inventor of Node.js, to start another JavaScript, a server-side JavaScript project. This time really focused on taking into account all the latest developments around cloud and how you could build distributed applications very efficiently and easily. So anyways, my co-founder Ryan Dahl, he's the CEO. I'm the CTO here at Deno, and these days I am mostly involved in the development of the Deno Deploy.
Yeah, which is a kind of a good segue into talking generally about subhosting as a product. So subhosting, it's a word we invented because we didn't necessarily know what the right term would be to describe kind of the product that we were putting together. But how would you describe subhosting? What is it? How does it work? And sort of how did we build it on top of the infrastructure that we have with Deno Deploy?
Yes. So, good question. So the way I think about this is primarily Deno Deploy is a platform for, building, allowing you to build websites or API servers with Deno, and then have a very easy way to put them live on the internet. So it integrates very nicely with GitHub, and, it has this workflow where you do a git push, and, that becomes your website basically with zero interaction. But what we have found is that a very big core component of this is how can we run any JavaScript that anyone might write ever securely, spin it up quickly, scale it up properly, etc. And what we found is that there are a lot of use cases where people might not want to necessarily deploy their own websites or their own API servers, but they want to deploy code on behalf of someone else. So, you can imagine a website builder or, some sort of, or basically anything that you can customize with code. So that's where we have that's where we see sort of the biggest difference. Either you do it as, do you do it for yourself or do you do it for someone else? And, there's a lot of overlap. It can, that way you can, really leverage the secure sandbox that we've built, but you also have different concerns, right? And now if you deploy code of someone else or multiple others, you don't want them to interfere with one another or leak data from one tenant of yours to the other. So I think that's the biggest difference. By the way, a little bit of the context of the name subhosting. we started doing this now, I think at this point 2 years ago or so. And initially, we really thought it would be mostly for use cases where, like, others would be deploying actual, or like our customers would be deploying actual websites on behalf of their users. And so hence the name subhosting. Host your website, and like, if you get Deno to host other people's websites, that is, you're essentially a reseller, right? That's why we call it subhosting. Not sure that name is really that appropriate anymore, but it kind of stuck around.
Yeah, no, it's a use case where when you need to have a product like this, it becomes very apparent that this type of solution is what you need. So before Deno, I worked for a long time at a company called Twilio, which is an API company that has SMS APIs, voice APIs, and we built out like quite a lot of code and a lot of like platform components for this like Twilio Functions product, which basically just allows you to host JavaScript code in the cloud that gets invoked when like your Twilio phone number gets a new text message, or like to handle incoming calls. Twilio also has like a visual like voice tree, like, or sort of phone tree builder product, and you can wire in those functions into that visual like sort of low code builder tool. And they had to build all that infrastructure themselves and kind of figure out how to not let data leak between tenants, and like how do you provision like preview versions of code, and like we would call them preview deployments, as we'll kind of show here in a demo in a little while. And had subhosting existed as a product then, we could have deleted, I don't even know how much code, and not had to worry about a lot of the complexity of that. So that, I think, like sort of that developer tool use case is one. What are some of the other use cases that you've seen people like using subhosting for, or kind of deploying it already for today?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty broad actually. So if you, but I'll give some like sort of conceptual examples here. So let's imagine you're building a SaaS product that has like, allows people to like visualize data, build beautiful dashboards, or like, generate reports or something. Things that you might want to do as a user of that is like make it talk to an external data source, like let's say an API server specific to the company that you work for. And of course, like, you as a SaaS vendor, you don't want to build connectors or clients for, servers that are run by your specific customers. Maybe you can do some generic connectors, some whatever, Google Sheets or whatever, some, CRM systems that are commonly used. But if you have something that is really specific to a customer, yeah, it's not tenable that you write your own connectors for all these. And so what we see companies do is like they say, well, why don't we, just let like our end users like do this themselves, and they don't have to like write a whole application platform, just like a little function that like can take data out of their own API and like for structure and format it in a way that like the rest of our SaaS platform can work with it. So that would be one of them. In the same example, or in the same sort of imaginary SaaS platform for dashboards, you can also imagine, custom formatting. Like what if you, or some data processing, what if you want to have a time series and you want to do some transformation on it that is not like, a standard math function? Wouldn't it be easy if you could just write a little function yourself that takes in data points and like spits out different data points? And, you can imagine having a dashboard, a website, right? Your SaaS project is probably a website. And, there can be a code editor where you can like type in 100 lines of code or 20, and that becomes sort of like a customization point for your product. Let's think about some other examples. We see that, if IFTTT, if this then that / low code solution. So, imagine, I'm trying to think of a good example here. Well, you can do something like this, for example, with Apple HomeKit. You can say if someone comes home, play a song or something. If you and we see there's a lot of like startups that are building products like that. If you want to allow people to mostly use blocks, but have an escape hatch, where they can actually write some code when it gets a little bit more complicated, or you would need a lot of blocks to express some logic. Then it's a natural point to say, well, why don't you just write the code yourself, and why don't you use a programming language that is super common and like almost everybody to some extent can understand. Other examples might be a little bit more boring, or like if you have like alternative ways to build websites, maybe even a blog, for example. You can build a nice WordPress like experience that lets people build blogs, but then if they want to customize, build a form or something, they can do this by typing in code. And then
yeah, for sure. I feel like there's just a lot of different like random edge cases out there where like, you want to give your end user the ability to write code and you want to execute it on their behalf in some kind of like secure sandboxed environment where you're not just, evaling their code like on your server and hoping for the best. And, this API is like in this platform is one way to do that.
Exactly. And if you think about it, basically, you can cast a very wide net. There are lots of platforms these days that support webhooks in one way or another. And like a webhook is really just, one side of an extension point, right? It's like, okay, we want to publish that something happened, and like we want to give the user a way to like take some action based upon that. But webhooks in a way are like really inconvenient because like it requires your user to find a provider, to like write a server, right, and make sure that it's always running, and now you have to like figure out how to debug that thing, and it's a lot of like onus that you put on your user that way. And so really you can see deploy subhosting as like an alternative to all those use cases. If you currently have webhooks, you could probably achieve what you want by using Deno Subhosting instead, and give your end user a much better user experience with that.
Yeah, for sure. Like a lot of times when like the user of your SaaS platform or your developer platform or wherever would have to like escape your platform and like use another vendor or a whole nother service to like stand up something just so that they can effectively use your software, like it's maybe not optimal user experience. So being able to kind of cut out that extra overhead of having to communicate with an external system definitely like makes your platform a little more sticky. Couple other things, like we actually already have some folks doing some pretty interesting amounts of traffic, some interesting use cases on top of subhosting. I think specifically Netlify is one of them, and I wonder, like maybe just say a few words about how they're using subhosting today.
Yeah, so Netlify is an interesting case. I mean, they were like the customer that we started with 2 years ago, and so they use a slightly different version of the current iteration of subhosting. But like what they do is like Netlify is a very easy way to publish your website, and Netlify started off as like a way, essentially as a static site generator. And so what we've seen in this space where people like what originally were static site generator is that people need some way of like doing customization of their website. Maybe you want to do some A/B testing. Maybe you want to do some regional. You want to display some specific information different in one region from another. Maybe you want to do something with a logged in experience. And so for those use cases, like Netlify allows you to do this, and their JavaScript functions run on our platform. Meanwhile, they use they have their own experience for like building your entire application, and also like they use their own CDN, etc. So like we really are the secure JavaScript sandbox to them.
Yeah, and like one of the other cool examples too, I think, is Deno CX, which is not like maybe a household name to developers in the same way that Netlify is potentially, but what they're doing is really sweet. Like how are they using the platform today?
Yeah, Deno CX is a really cool case. You probably haven't heard of it because they are really big in like South America at this point, and maybe not so much in the Western world. But and they're also like a very new but very fast growing company. What Deno CX does is they a lot of e-commerce is uses whatever, like I forgot the terminology here, but like there are e-commerce backends are like backends only. Like they're and an API, but no like built-in or good built-in front end for them. And so what DecoChex is all about, building like good-looking e-commerce front ends. And they've built like sort of a what you see is what you get editor for them for this use case that has like a lot of like components that you can just plug in, that you don't actually have to write any code for. And if you do want to write code, you can do that. There are like places you can put code, and then their system puts it all together, and it deploys the running code on the running JavaScript on Deno Deploy. And one thing to note about DecoChex is also that it leverages server-side rendering extensively. So basically, if you use a JavaScript-based framework, you can use a single-page app essentially, which has pros and cons. You can also render everything on the server, and like that can make the experience very fast for your visitors. And that's what they leverage here too. And they've been growing like crazy. This was a very nerve-wracking Black Friday for us last week, just because they had so much volume on our system in certain regions.
Yeah, the app itself is just really sweet. It's one of the cooler like Squarespace style like app builders that I've seen out there. And the fact that it does like most of the rendering server side is amazing in the e-commerce space, because like page load, like I don't know what the conversion is, but it's like every 250 milliseconds you shave off of a page load time like increases your conversion by like 0.5% or whatever. So like those small changes really add up, like if performance is critical. And it certainly is, like in that e-commerce space. So yeah, some pretty cool stuff that's happening already. And I will get into some demos, and we'll take a look at kind of the higher level picture of how the Subhosting API works before we dive into the details. But one thing I wanted to talk through, because it's a question we get a lot, is like, all right, like you have this API for deploying code to the Subhosting or like the Deno cloud. When would I like consider using this instead of like AWS Lambda, say, has like a REST API that sits on top of it, and like theoretically maybe I could do the same thing. So like when are maybe some ways I would want to consider, or some things that I wanted to consider with like Subhosting versus like using Lambda or something like that?
Yeah, so I mean, very good question. It's all computers. You could probably achieve the same if you tried really hard.
They'll do whatever they tell you to do. Yeah, whatever you tell them to do.
With AWS Lambda. But I think so Deno Deploy is like really optimized for, it's in a way more limited, right? It can only run JavaScript, but then what we take out of the equation is like, creating like starting up really quickly. So, if your function is not too complicated, we can start up in milliseconds. Like we don't have to load containers, like Deno's already running. We create a sandbox that is like totally closed off, or like I'm in a way virtualized from the rest of the world. So you don't have to worry that like, which files can this thing like access, etc. And, we take all the management pieces, like, and management, I mean, like, okay, your deployed code needs to be stored somewhere, like you need to spin up one or more V8 engines whenever, like, the request rate like requires it, and then like at some point like shut it down, etc. So, managing the code that you deploy, like getting it to the right place, scaling up and scaling down to zero, that is like a big part of like, the work that you would have to put in to get this done on AWS Lambda. AWS Lambda is also, it uses a different model. Like, of course, like every Lambda is a container in and of itself, but it will like only process like one request at a time. It will, you get billed per CPU second that it is running. In our system, that's very different. If you create like a subhosting script that runs in our system, it can run multiple like requests, process multiple requests concurrently up to like, until of course you saturate one CPU, and then we will spin up more if you get to that point. And you get billed only for like CPU time that you actually use. Yeah, I think that's probably the biggest advantage of using Deno subhosting.
Yeah, I think like the CPU billing is interesting because like if you think about a lot of the glue code that you write on the back end, like if you're talking to multiple APIs, like you're talking to databases that are maybe hosted elsewhere, like a lot of your application time is actually just spent like waiting. You're just waiting on a response from your database, from your API server or whatever. But like in the Lambda world, like you're still paying for that time while you wait, versus in the Deno Deploy billing model, like when you're not actually using the CPU and you're waiting on IO, that isn't like CPU time you're billed for. So it ends up being interesting, an interesting way to compare it there for sure.
Yeah.
Cool. So
one other thing, by the way, that I would like to mention is like if you would try to do this on AWS Lambda, you have to figure out, how to whatever, take end user code, like maybe zip it, then go unzip it, like on your Lambda, etc., whatever. Like compile TypeScript, or maybe like you don't like this model and you want to like actually build like a container for every tenant. Like there's a lot of like moving pieces that go into that, which as we have experienced ourselves, if you do it that way, it all becomes kind of slow. And so our system is really optimized to like do this process like super fast.
Yeah, and honestly, like not like being able to ship just raw TypeScript to the cloud to be executed is pretty nice. Like you don't have to put a compile step in the middle on your side before you make that happen. So of course, like the Deno runtime itself kind of helping us out with that. But the other thing I was going to ask about, like, which is actually a good segue. So there are features of the Deno runtime that are supported in subhosting today. TypeScript by default being one of those things. NPM specifiers is another thing that is available today in subhosting and in Deno Deploy generally, which is, I believe, still the only way to like natively run NPM modules in like a at least in an isolate cloud, like in in an edge runtime like this one that is running a custom JavaScript runtime. And then you can also like attach like KV databases. So Deno KV is a key value store that's built into the Deno runtime and also works on deploy. So a lot of these things work on subhosting today, but I wondered if you would talk a little bit about like the things that maybe are different or like maybe not available on subhosting today that is available in Deno Deploy or in Deno generally. And then to the extent we know it, like what are we planning for the future to build into subhosting? Like what are some of the other features and things on the roadmap?
Yeah. Good question. So most features that exist in end user in our end user platform do exist in subhosting, as you mentioned. And I think I would call out two that don't. Like one of them currently is sort of the GitHub integration. That's where it gets a little bit more tricky because if you are doing something on behalf of your customers and you want to use GitHub in the mix, then we imagine it would be a very complicated dance between your system and our system and GitHub to all make it go smoothly. So I would say never, but that's currently not where we are focusing on. And the other thing you mentioned was KV. KV absolutely works in subhosting. We have just released some KV-related extended features. Cron, which is like scheduling tasks and like queues, which is like think RabbitMQ or like Amazon SQS, something similar. Those are not yet available in subhosting, but I expect us to be able to deliver that pretty soon too. These are really just a matter of like defining the semantics. What does it mean to schedule a cron job if you have a bunch of functions and you want to, for example, upgrade one function to another because you have an error in your scheduled task handler or your queue handler, like those. So they're essentially edge cases that we have to work out, but in general you can expect that to become available. What I am just as excited about is like there are definitely some features that are very specific to what subhosters need, around the corner. So the first one that I would like to mention here is layers. What we call layers maybe is best described by giving you a little bit of a use case. Imagine that you are going to build a custom code editor, as a customization point into your SaaS app. And what you would likely want to do is like make some SDK for that's very specific to the SaaS app that you're embedding your code editor in, available to like in that JavaScript context. So imagine the dashboard customization example that I gave earlier. Maybe you want to have some data transformation functions, or like a function that renders a graph. Like that's not something that's built into the Deno platform, but it makes sense for you to build it into your into the code environment that you show to your customers. So here what we imagine is like adding a feature called layers, where essentially you can automatically mix our standard platform code and your customer code with some SDK that you provide yourself, and have an easy way to manage, for example, upgrade those SDKs. This feature at this point has already been built, because like in the iteration of subhosting that Netlify uses, they are a heavy user of this. But we have some work to do to make this available to everyone, essentially. So that's layers. There's another one that I would like to mention. Of course, if you use Deno to host websites, then you want your functions or APIs that you deploy to us to be available to the world. We are also working on a way to essentially make them private. So some mechanism for you to say, I not every Joe Schmo should be able to invoke this function, and only if an invocation comes from our system, from your SaaS platform, should it actually run. Of course, you can already achieve this today by putting some logic in the function itself that says, okay, well, if this token is not provided, then I'm gonna just return an error instead of actually do anything. But we want to make this really smooth and easy for people. The other way around is also, of course, an interesting case. If let's say that you want to run some customer code that can talk to a private backend of yours, then our system needs to essentially authenticate a deployment, a function, to your backend. And again, you can currently do this. We just support this feature called environment variables. You can use them as secrets, and you could in theory put some token in there. However, we also believe that this should be much easier for you to do, and we're working on this. This part will probably use OIDC to some extent. The last thing that I would like to mention, I can't give you an ETA on this, but we are very interested in providing you with, part of building Deno Deploy into your platform is also providing a code editor component. And there are good open source code editor components out there. Monaco, for example, the one that Visual Studio Code uses. But I think there's still a little bit of work to do, and we do believe that we can make it easier by providing you with a little bit of a higher level embeddable code editor component. So those are the ones that maybe are the most interesting to mention here.
Yeah, for sure. Very stoked for the layers feature. I think that is going to be one that'll be a major differentiator with something like using the Lambda API directly, because in that scenario, you'll have to execute some kind of build process where you would concatenate or in some other way mix in your SDK code with user created code, and then deploy that bundle together to something like Lambda, which is fraught. It's tricky to do that in a way that doesn't break and isn't too janky, but it's certainly critical to do. In the Twilio functions example I talked about before, that's a very concrete use case where within the context of that function, we want you to be able to use the Twilio API to list your phone numbers or whatever, and use the Node SDK in the same way you could in server-side code otherwise. So there's a lot of really good reasons why you'd want to sort of customize the JavaScript environment that your customer's code executes in.
Yeah, I would like to mention here, by the way, this use case that you described, like it is possible today. I mean, like, and there are people
Oh,
that
sure.
when they create a deployment, they take the user code and just add some files that they wrote
Mhm.
that they wrote as a platform. But yeah, management becomes hard. So like, okay, you want to fix a bug in your SDK, and you have to like redeploy everything. And I think the other thing is, I mean, we we try to make our platform really fast, but there is of course somewhat of a rule that the bigger you make your functions, the slower it gets, or slower it starts up. And with layers, we were able to optimize that for a very large part, because we can there's magic going on here. But like essentially, like if you have many functions that all use the same layer, then we need to load that layer only once. And that just optimizes it a whole lot.
Yeah, for sure. Well, awesome. Well, for the folks that are hanging out live, we'll have a chance for you to ask some questions a little bit later. So if you do have questions you want to have either me or Bert take a crack at, please feel free to throw them in the chat wherever you're consuming this video stream, and we'll make sure to get to them towards the end. But before we do that, I just wanted to do a quick demo of kind of a simple use case of the API to kind of point out some of the key moving parts, so that you have sort of a more practical sense of how the parts of the API come together. So when we talk about building an application with subhosting, you'll start off by creating an organization within like the Deno platform, which is basically a container for all of the resources of your project you can enjoy, or like the resources of your sort of application, I guess you might say. And you can invite collaborators to it, and you can kind of control access to the organization. And within the organization, much like kind of the end user platform today, which works a lot like a Netlify or a Vercel or something like that, where you would create projects and provision domains for those projects and kind of manage websites in that regard. You also use projects as a construct within Deploy as well. A project is a container for deployments, and deployments are kind of like where the rubber hits the road to actually put code on the internet. So when you create a project, that project will have many deployments, which are essentially runnable instances of applications that will be deployed on a URL that you can send requests to. But the project container will sort of aggregate all the logs and activity for that application or for that project, such that you can kind of see what's happening across multiple deployments. And you can also track usage associated with a project as well. So you can use that as like a container for like seeing how much your end users are consuming consuming resources within subhosting, in case like your billing model is such that maybe you want to pass that expense or like mark up that expense in some way within your platform. And a deployment, which is again an instance of runnable code, can have JavaScript and TypeScript source code files associated with it. It can include static files, images, CSS, or JavaScript that's intended to go to the client. Or you can also have environment variables. So like when that code executes, you can give it access to secrets or other things that it needs to access from the system environment. And each of those deployments can also be assigned to a custom domain. So if you want to associate a URL, which is a little more friendly than the randomly generated ones in the Deno platform, you're able to do that. And you can also give deployments access to KV databases. So if you want to create a KV database and maybe share it across all deployments, so maybe a given project is one set of deployments associated with a customer. All those deployments might want to share the same KV database, and you have granular control over like which KV database each deployment has access to as well. So just a quick high-level overview of the moving parts, but I think a better way to understand how it works is to show a little bit of a demo that actually exercises the API. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And let's just make sure that that is working. I'm going to pop over to, I'll just go ahead and share this tab. That should be sufficient. So If everything is working well, you should be seeing a screen that is sort of set up to be like a simple IDE for subhosting. So it sits over the top of the Subhosting API and allows you to create projects and create code that actually runs as a part of those deployments. So what happens here is I configure like an organization ID, which is something you can get off of the Deno dashboard. I can show where that is here in just a second. And we have a list of projects that exist within that organization in the dashboard. And when I select different ones, you can see a list of deployments that have been made to those projects. And then within this code editor, this is just an embedded code editor. This one uses something called Code Mirror, which along with Monaco is one of the popular like open source options in the space. The Code Mirror editor, I believe, is the one that's embedded into the Chrome DevTools, or was until relatively recently. So I think actually they still do use it, but that's the one that's embedded here. And basically whatever code is in this window is going to be sent as a deployment to this project, which is currently selected. So if I change this text to, hello world, I can change it to, hello subhosting. And if I hit save and deploy, deployment is created. And then in a second, you'll see it'll actually show up in the list of deployments over here on the right, which I believe would be this one here. Let me just double check that. And I can put that in this tab here just so you can see what I'm seeing. But there's that hello subhosting deployment. And I'll just go back here. But basically for each of these projects, I see the deployments over here, and I can create a new deployment using the code in the editor. I can also create new projects from this interface as well. But the application itself is actually not super interesting. It's built on using Retool, which is a low-code platform, which is really useful for building out little prototypes like this one. But I'll actually step through some of like the API integrations, which I think are the more interesting thing to kind of grok how this is working under the covers. So let me go ahead and edit this application. And again, this is the sort of the Retool platform, which lets you kind of drag and drop these UI components together. But the thing that'll be more interesting are these REST API queries that I have set up to power these different parts of the application. So the process required to create a deployment is you first have to have a project available. So you can use an existing project or you can create a project. And within Retool, they kind of give you this like almost Postman-like sort of graphical interface to let you set up these integrations with your API. But what I've done is I've configured this API resource, which just has like the base URL configured. It also has like my a Deno Deploy token, which I use in bearer authentication against the endpoint, which is what allows me to actually make authenticated requests to api.deno.com. So that's kind of configured and shared across all of these different requests. But then I can create, post requests that hit these different parts of the API. So if I want to create a project, I'm going to, use this organization ID as a path parameter and send a post request to /organizations, org ID projects to create a new project. And I can set up a JSON body. So when you make like post requests to most of the API endpoints, you're usually assembling a JSON body that you send along with the post requests. And in this case, that JSON is going to have a single key, which is going to be the name of the project. If you pass in null as the name of the project, one is going to be automatically created for you. You can specify a custom name, but if you do that, the way things work right now is that name actually has to be sort of globally unique within the Deno Deploy platform because we provision subdomains around it, and there's a few other reasons there. So that's one thing to be aware of. If you don't care about what the subdomain is called, you can pass in null, and that's usually sufficient. So if I were to leave that blank, I can create a project. And then within my project list, I have like this new one, which is, Sweet Goose 93, which has no deployments. So after you have a project, then you need to create a deployment. And this create deployment API endpoint, again, uses the same subhosting API that we have configured, but this is the URL that we use. So we have a unique identifier for a project, and then we post to the deployments endpoint associated with that project. And just as before, we want to create a post body that we're going to send with this request. But creating a deployment is actually one of the more complicated API endpoints that exist within the REST API, because there's so many things that you can configure about a deployment. So I actually created a little chunk of JavaScript code which assembles that post body and then JSON stringifies it so that we can use it in an API request. So this is about the smallest, potential set of inputs that you can provide to create a deployment. Every deployment needs an entry point, and this is going to be a source code file that when your deployment happens, like, we're going to use the Deno runtime to run this code. And typically that's going to, start an HTTP server, maybe set up a cron job. It's going to be, again, like sort of the main entry point for your application. And when you talk about it as an entry point, it also aligns with this other argument to the API called assets. And this assets object basically contains all of the content that's going to be inside of your deployment. So if you imagine like deploying a web application project, like maybe from the command line, where you're in a folder that has, a bunch of source code files in it and, images and CSS that you want to sort of upload as a web application. This is the place where you would specify like that payload of all those different files that should exist within the deployment. So the keys for this asset object are going to be essentially like the full file paths, which within sort of like a virtual file system, which describes the contents of your deployment. And these assets, they can be files, they can be symbolic links. There's a few others that are documented within the REST API documentation. But in this case, we're sending a source code file, which is going to be UTF-8 encoded. And the contents of that file are going to be whatever is inside this code editor over here. And I won't explain too much of the retool magic here, but basically this double curly brace syntax thing takes the string content of this code editor and puts it inside this part of the JSON, or what will ultimately be the JSON body. And then this little chunk of code serializes it to JSON, which we then use in this create deployment API request. And if I hit save and deploy over here, this is actually, live already. So here, if I see the first deployment for my Sweet Goose 93 project that I just created. And you can't see that right now because I have to show it in this tab. But just to prove that there is nothing up my sleeve, I will go there and show you that we have a hello world response that's coming up there. So to actually put code on the internet using the subhosting API is actually not that hard. It's really just a handful of API requests. You're going to be creating a project or choosing an existing project, and then you're going to be using this create projects API endpoint, create deployment API endpoint to send up all the information you would need to actually have a deployment of JavaScript code running on a URL somewhere. So we have a lot of this information in the documentation. So if you go to docs.deno.com, head over to deploy and into subhosting, we have this about subhosting sort of quick start example that takes you through this process in a fully non-visual way. And this set of code right here is basically what you need to get set up in order to do a very basic subhosting implementation. You're going to configure API access, you'll create a new project, and then you'll create a deployment with some amount of code in it that will, be assigned a URL and becomes, something that you can call. So with not very many steps, you're able to kind of get started and have this secure sandbox to run untrusted code, which you can, of course, do lots more complicated things on top of it. But actually getting started is just a few lines of code. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to all of you on the stream to see if you have any questions. If there's anything that you'd like to see a little bit more of, any questions you have for us, please feel free to fire away. But while we're giving folks time to think, a question I have is, there's there are various services like Replit and maybe AutoCode and other like browser-based environments that allow you to execute code. Because subhosting is relatively new, they don't use subhosting as a backend. Like, what would you have to do without subhosting in order to like create an application like that? Like, what would be the things involved, like theoretically?
Yeah, I mean, well, I would start with deciding what you would what kind of code you would want your platform to run. Like, is it like just JavaScript? Is it like entire like Linux environments or anything? I think that really like would drive a lot of the design decisions here. But imagine that if you have a requirement that you can, it's very interactive. You can like create code very fast. I think working with relatively big Linux containers where like you have to start up the container and then you have to start up something inside the container and then you have to like load code it or send code to it somehow. It's probably not what you want to do. So okay, let's imagine that you run like a bunch of like, take a Kubernetes cluster or something, put some like Virgin Node or Deno runtimes into it. Now you're gonna ask yourself, okay, like, is there any risk of like letting the user run any code in here? And like, it's gonna go from okay, are there any files on the default file system to like, okay, this is running in a cloud environment. Is this VM able to access a server that exposes secrets? Like all those things you will have to like lock down. And then the next question is, okay, well maybe, okay, I've that all locked down. Do I want the end user code to use unlimited resources here, or can I limit that somehow? And so now you have to find or define your sandbox to like kill execution after a couple seconds or whatever. Like look for memory usage, etc. That seems maybe with Kubernetes pretty simple, but it's actually quite a little bit more complicated than that, because how the V8 engine kind of responds to how much memory is available when it decides to do garbage collection and whatnot. So like, okay, now you have that all set up. Now you need a system where, or an API where, you can send code to. Now you're going to store that somewhere and you're going to decide to spin up one or create multiple containers that run this stuff for users. I don't know, this is just the beginning. I don't know how far you want me to go.
No, basically, this was a trap so that I could get you to complain about the stuff that you had to do implementing the subhosting API. So you fell into my trap perfectly and gave folks enough time to ask some questions, which I'll throw up the first one now. So Kurt asks, what's the recommended approach for managing secrets on Deno Deploy? Environment variables are in the dashboard, but it's not able to be retrieved in local development, which is at the moment true, right? So like within I don't think we have in our sort of command line tooling a way to do that. But yeah, I mean, how would you maybe recommend folks approach handling and managing secrets for Deno Deploy right now?
I mean, the options are, of course, a bit limited until we like ship authenticate the invocation. But I mean, I would use environment variables. So, I mean, those are, if you put environment variables in our system, they're not easily exposed. Of course, they're exposed to your JavaScript code, but like you cannot get like the secrets out from the outside through the API, or that we won't show them in the dashboard, etc. And that I'm not maybe entirely sure if I understand the question correctly. I think you can use environment variables in a local environment. You type them into your terminal, and or you put them in a .env file, and then use like the .env module in Deno std to fetch them from there.
Yeah. I suspect like one of the things involved here, and I don't mean to put words in your mouth, Kurt, but like one of the things that maybe doesn't exist in with Deno Deploy's tooling today that you might have seen in other platforms is the ability to kind of like fetch environment variables from your deployed instance and then like store them locally or sort of sync them up with your local development environment, or kind of go the other way and like send environment variables to your deploy project from local. Like the Firebase CLI is one example off the top of my head that like lets you do that. You can kind of dump secrets from production and have them locally, or you can kind of go the other way. I do believe we have some similar features and functionality that are sort of on the roadmap for deploy CTL, or deploy cuddle, as we like to call it, which is like the command line interface to deploy. That'll kind of help juggle those things a little bit more directly. But from like an implementation standpoint, as Bert said, you can certainly write code that just sort of expects to consume environment variables. And then those environment variables can be configured in the GUI and deploy today, or via API, which is actually something I didn't show in the demo earlier. I didn't speak to anyway. And maybe is let me just show it real. That's okay. Within the documentation, you can see like one of the bare minimum like API parameters you have to send along with a deployment creation request is a JavaScript object that's an array of environment or that's not an array, but it's an object sort of hash of environment variables. So in subhosting specifically, you do have programmatic access to be able to set those environment variables as well. So good question there. And then a question from Craig, who asked, like, how do you use code not created in the source code editor? So I imagine that refers to the demo where I had like an embedded editor that, I actually had code that I wrote in there, and then I passed that as an API, like within the API request to create a deployment. A lot of times, if you're implementing subhosting, what you do is you'd either have some kind of interface for like your end users or your developers to either maybe they would write code in the browser, or maybe they would upload code to you or send code to you in some way. Like let's say you're Netlify, they have like a really nice slick like GitHub integration where, you push your code up to GitHub and then they grab it from there and then they deploy your static website across, in their infrastructure. And then as a part of that process, they would take JavaScript code that's within your application and then use it and then send it to deploy through the API that way. So the kind of right now, the sort of the implementation detail of like how you get that code from your end user, there's a lot of different ways to do that. But when you make that deployment creation request, you can pass in a string of code which contains all of the contents. It can also be, I believe, like base64 encoded. Are there ways I'm missing, Bert, of like other ways you can send code to the API?
No, yeah. So I imagine. So I'm assuming here about like what the intention of the person who asked the question is, but if you want to like send a number of files, some of them might be coming from a code editor, and others might be coming from a database or from the file system. Like at the end of the day, you want to build a big JSON object that basically gives you like file name with and then the content associated with that file. And yeah, you can encode them in a number of different ways. Like that is one way you can go about it. The other thing, and that might be interesting in some use cases, is of course like you can also import like from any URL, just like you can in the Deno CLI. So if you have an SDK that you can publish on some URL, then you can just import that in the little like user code snippet and like get that, make that part of your deployment. When you create a new deployment, like we will run this build process that like transfiles TypeScript and also like basically fetches all the dependencies for you and builds them into sort of a bundle so that we can load it quickly. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, hopefully we got close there. Yeah, using HTTP imports is an interesting way to approach like bundling or sending code along with the deployment potentially. Another question, a couple of good questions here. So what's going to be next for subhosting and deploy? Like, when are you going to build a CDN for static assets, Bert, that you can use?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, so probably not anytime soon as far as CDNs go. So, I think we do hear a lot of requests from people for us doing this. So it's a totally valid question. I think it makes sense for static assets that are not backed by any code or generated by any code to just live on like a very fast distributed CDN. I think that our bigger challenge is like, we are a small company that is really good at creating sandbox for JavaScript, and we are not necessarily the experts in building CDN. So I think where you can expect this to go is like, we might integrate with one or a number of like very good CDN providers at some point, and like enable them, and so that gives you a little bit of freedom and gives you the same functionality. But I don't imagine that we will be building our own CDN anytime soon. There is something that's maybe a little bit closer and not really not entirely related to CDNs, but there are cases where you do actually generate files in code, but like once generated, they don't really change very much. And so there is an API called the Web Cache API that's currently not available in Deno Deploy, and we do want to make that available. So use case there would really be like if you generate some HTML on first visit, you really just want to do that once and not keep doing that over and over again. So that's what might make that a little bit easier. As far as what was the other one, blob and object stores goes, I think I'm not going to make any promises here. It's another one where we actually have some internal prototypes where this would be essentially an extension of KV. KV currently has a size limit for objects, which is, I believe, 64K. Of course, there are very good use cases for storing more or for bigger chunks of data, but we don't think that our infrastructure is based by FoundationDB is really like suitable for that. But there are some internal demos where larger objects essentially end up essentially in a cloud storage bucket of some sort. I'm not going to make any promises there, but that's on our radar.
Yeah, definitely not the first time we've heard those bits, and it'll be nice to have a solution kind of baked into the platform for the static assets, especially as Fresh is starting to integrate. Fresh framework, for those of you who don't use it, it's one of the first party supported like web frameworks on Deno Deploy, and it's kind of doing more and more like with sort of pre-building and optimizing like static assets that are a part of Fresh projects. So it's a backend is definitely more within Deno's wheelhouse and where we're going to be spending a lot of our time, but there probably are going to be some use cases where it will be it might make sense for us to explore that in the future. So excellent question. Definitely appreciate it. And I think that's going to wrap it up for us in terms of the live questions and for the time we have. But once again, wanted to thank all of you for hanging out with us live, asking questions, checking out the demo with us. It was very fun for us to share a little bit about how subhosting works. If you missed part of the live broadcast, worry not. We have been recording it and streaming this live to YouTube, so you can watch the recording on YouTube whenever it is convenient for you. And if you have any more questions about subhosting or anything Deno related, the best place to get in touch with us is on the Discord. So if you go to discord.gg/Deno, that is going to get you into the Deno Discord server. We also have it linked from the website, and we'd love to hear from you and hear whatever questions you have or feedback you have on using subhosting. So once again, thank you to everyone who hung out. Thank you, Bert, for joining up with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. Super fun as always. And thanks to everyone for hanging out, and we'll see you next time.